Welcome to the Simpleton Podcast. This is the official podcast of A Simple House of Saints Francis and Alphonsus. I'm Clark Massey here in KCMO. I'm here with Laura Heeman out in
Maryland, outside of DC.
Sweet.
Hey, Clark.
Hey. We're doing a spiritual direction podcast. It's not kind of an exhaustive podcast. If you're a spiritual director, you listen to it, you'll be like, you didn't mention the three most important things. I think we're going to do a pretty good job of covering, but there's going to be a lot of things that we're not being particular about, right? Laura did not want to do this podcast.
I thought you were going to want to do a whole podcast condemning like all modern spiritual direction and have some strange idea.
And that is why you're here, to keep this from being too strange of an idea. All right, our signpost here is what you need to do before you seek a spiritual director. 2, an overview of kind of the theories of spiritual direction and pitfalls and things you want to avoid in spiritual direction and from spiritual directors. And then we're going to talk about our own experiences of spiritual direction and why Simple House doesn't do spiritual direction with the people at Simple House. What do you do before you seek a spiritual director?
What do you do? So I had this favorite professor in college who was a Dominican priest, and he used to like to make fun of me a lot. But I loved him and I respected him, and I asked him to be my spiritual director. So he said, all right, let's meet. I go to his office. He asks me about my prayer life. I tell him what I do, and he's like, okay, well, if I'm going to be your spiritual director, you first need to get a spiritual life. So thank you, Father Shanley. And the point he was making, I don't think he totally meant that, right? But the point he was making was I needed to be more intentional, more regular about my prayer. I was like praying here and there, doing this campus ministry thing or whatever, but I didn't have a very like set out spiritual life where I was like doing XYZ every morning or, reading the Bible regularly with any sort of intentional idea of how I should do it. And so it's kind of like if you're going to make an appointment with a spiritual director to talk about like what God is doing, you need to be like meeting your appointments, right, with God first. Yeah.
Right. Oh, I think there's like universal things, like you can almost tell any Catholic, hey, you should go to Mass, or hey, you should, maybe pray a rosary, right? But I think spiritual direction is not one of those things. I think you first have to have some intentionality and be applying yourself to the spiritual life where this doesn't make sense.
Right. Right. God is like already, you go to spiritual direction to kind of like understand what God is saying in your life or something. And it's like God is already speaking in very clear ways to us, like the 10 Commandments, repent, do not sin. And so it's like we should already be sort of accepting what is being like has been revealed is like obviously revealed to all, Catholics and Christians, and, trying to engage deeper, be spending time with the Bible, be spending time in regular prayer, sacraments regularly. Right.
And also that I think goes to the second point that before you go to spiritual direction, you want to have spiritual friendships. Mm-hmm. And this has been a very important theme in my life because like I've often just thought of spiritual direction as to cover things that my spiritual friends can't. Meaning like if you have friends that you're really sharing your spiritual life with, you're talking about your problems with, who can give you feedback if you're being too harsh or need to be more merciful or need to, take any type of like practical spiritual action in your life, or can tell you when you're getting a little bit too weird. That will solve a lot of spiritual issues in life, right? Yeah. And these are also people who see you in life, whereas like a spiritual director often knows what you tell them, right? Yeah. So someone who's closed off to having these spiritual friends coach them along is kind of just, and then goes to spiritual direction, is kind of getting an artificial thing because they don't want people who actually are in their lives helping them. They want people who don't know what's going on, who they can control the narrative with, right?
And I feel like the friend is kind of like somebody that you can start like practicing, like interpreting the world, interpreting people, interpreting God with. And then you go to the spiritual director, who is a person that is like more practiced in like thinking in the mind of the gospel, you know.
I've often thought that even if the spiritual director had no more wisdom than any of my friends, I often needed them as an authority figure, because like there'll come issues where it's like you kind of see both sides of the issue. Your friends kind of told you both sides of the issue. Maybe they're split. You really don't know if both sides seem to have good points. And it's like, I just need somebody to just tell me which to go left or right, you know?
Yeah.
And I found that useful.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of times, like we want like some certainty, or like knowing that we're not making the right choice, you know, or we regret maybe a choice we did make. And when you can say like, I tried to figure this out the best I can. I consulted somebody. I made the best decision I could. Then there's like a sort of freedom in that, even if it kind of doesn't turn out that well.
Right.
You know, there's just like a freedom that is wonderful.
Or there's like, you know, there's spiritual blind spots that we all have. So like in the founding of Simple House, there's this idea like, well, if I started a ministry, is that just pride? Is that just me not being too difficult to work with and all these other ministries, right? Yeah. And like, I would be the last one to know if that's true. You know what I mean? So then you go to the spiritual director and you're like, look, I think I need to do this. I'm also worried about all this other stuff. And I wouldn't be the one who knew if that was the issue. Should I do this? And they're like, go for it. And you're like, yes. All right. And then it kind of gives you that permission to go for it. After you build these spiritual friendships, I want to say something else. A classic Simple House interview question is, do you have friendships from high school that are still important to you? Yeah. And the idea there is, are you growing with these friendships? Are you traveling through life with these people? Or are you just like, I just have friends I made in the last 3 months, you know, or my senior year or something of college? And the secondary question we ask is, do you have friends that are not Catholic, who aren't just people you go bowling with, but like people who you would share a problem with, you know?
Yeah.
And I do that to kind of see how ideological the person is. Like some people don't, and it's fine. But like if someone says, you know, I do have friends that I relate deeply with who are not, maybe they're Christian, maybe they're not Christian, but like I would take advice from them on certain issues. You know, it shows like a certain openness, you know?
Yeah.
And I think it's biblical too. I think there's examples in the Bible, in the Old Testament, of people outside the Jewish faith who were the voice box of God, you know, or the prophet of God, Balaam being one. But then another idea is that like, you can't be too prejudiced when you pick your friends. You don't want to be like an elitist where you're only taking the best Catholic friends, because Jesus has the prostitutes and the tax collectors recognizing him and following him, while the religious people aren't.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, if you are picking your friends so carefully, right, you're just going to end up picking the friends that agree with you and have your same spiritual blind spots, right? Yeah. Yeah. And I like the openness, like when you have friends that are maybe not Catholic or whatever, or walking some other path, and you're still able to like kind of gain and share from their experience and then from yours, it shows, that you're just a person that can like take things in and weed out the good, weed out the bad, and like apply to your life, you know?
It also shows your ability to evangelize, because you're able to sympathetically explain what you're going through as a Christian to someone and have them relate with it, you know, which is important. But I think all this goes into the last thing you need to do before you get a spiritual director, which is be open about your spiritual life and be open to change in your spiritual life. There are people with spiritual issues or mental issues or all types of issues who want to rehash the same problem over and over and over with their friends, with whoever, with their therapist. It's not clear they want to be better. You know, they're not really open to change. One of the things I see is like Catholics can get stuck on like kind of a party mentality or an ideological mentality within the religion, where they'll kind of start a conversation by telling you the conclusion. They'll be like, I think the worst thing that's happening is XYZ, or I was so scandalized by Z, or I love so-and-so is so holy. And then they want to tell you all the reasons why. And what they're kind of doing is they're signaling, if you want to be accepted by me, you agree with this, and now let's all agree on all these reasons and explain why it's so true, as opposed to saying, hey, this is what's happening, this happened, this happened, this happened, what do you think? Here's what I think. That's an openness to having that other person speak into your life. You know, like say a family member did something wrong to you, or you perceive they did something wrong to you, and you want to shut them down or cut them out of your life or do whatever, right? You can just start that conversation looking for input, or you can start that conversation looking for backup.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And if you're in the looking for backup mode, you're not quite ready to go to a spiritual director.
Yeah. Similarly, if you're just looking for like connection, you know, and I think it's like, can be nice when you feel like you're having like a spiritual conversation, you're like connecting deeply with something. And I think sometimes you can kind of get more into the connection than actually problem solving or managing whatever, or, you know, revealing truth. So, yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. You're looking for something other than real input and change. You're looking for consolation or something like that in a relationship.
Yeah.
Let's transition as to what is the point of spiritual direction now. I think a truth that I'm always trying to honor in all my spiritual friendships, even when I go to spiritual direction, is that there really is like an infinity of persons. You know, like we do know that like certain things are definitively wrong. We know certain things are good, but there's really an infinity of persons, and God is interacting with people in a sense in an infinite way. You know, so there's like this infinity of relationships with God.
There's that great Pope Benedict had that great. Somebody asked him how many ways were there to God, and he said as many as there are people. Right. And I love that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what that kind of means is if you have this idea where like the way you travel to God is the way, or this ideology that you were taught, like there is this one path to God that's going to fit everyone. I mean, you even see this in the church. Like, why do we have so many religious orders? These are schools of holiness, you know, and they're pretty different, you know, and have different, you know, charisms and fashions and all types of traditions, you know. That diversity is there because of this diversity of relationship, right?
Right.
You don't want to be a spiritual directee or a friend of someone or whatever, where you're getting shoehorned into someone else's vision of exactly how you need to be relating with God. It kind of kills the mystery of the relationship.
Yeah. And I think like with the role of the director, it's not so much, telling you what to do, you know, as much as like awakening a thing in you or helping you recognize the thing that there is to do in your life, you know, rather than giving you the like exact directions.
From there, I think the next point would be there's a teachable and unteachable part of the spiritual life. And the first time I came across this idea was when we were sitting down at Simple House and trying to teach people how to do ministry. And you and I had been doing ministry for a while, and we were like, well, how do we create like a curriculum to help other people do this?
Yeah.
And you start realizing some people get it without a curriculum, and some people you can give them as much teaching as you want and they're not going to get it. And that was like interesting. It was like there's a big part of what ministry is and spiritual direction and the spiritual life that is in this realm of kind of the unteachable, like the intuitive realm. And it doesn't mean that two people can't come together and talk through something and hint at it, but it does mean you're not going to be able to put it on paper with a conscious outline and a tree diagram, like a systemic theological statement, right?
Right.
And one of the things I found interesting about this, and like if you read like the sayings of the Desert Fathers, these are kind of spiritual direction sayings. Oftentimes they're literally spiritual direction. It's like the students going out to the great old man asking for a word. You know, that's literally spiritual direction. And there was this idea within Catholicism where it was called spiritual theology, and it's still taught in seminaries, usually along with moral theology. But it got to the point where the way I discovered this was in the Christian prayer book of the Liturgy of the Hours, they have this great little excerpt. And then I thought, oh, that's pretty good. What book's that from? And at the bottom, it said it was from The Theology of Christian Perfection by, I think, two Dominicans, Alman and Royo. And I was like, what a title, The Theology of Christian Perfection. Like, I need to go find this book.
Yeah.
So I went to the Dominican House of Studies in D.C., and they had like 7 copies of it, right, in their library. So I looked, and they were all, I think this is what I had some checkout privileges at D House, and I think it was because of this book. And it was literally a classroom textbook, like it was like sorted into chapters with, all the different types of bold print and everything you would have in a classroom textbook, And they were like really dog-eared and well used, but they weren't being used for classes anymore, as far as I could tell. Like they were quite old, Mm-hmm. And since then, Alman's come out with a few more books. So then I went on like Abe Books. This is like 20 years ago. I went to go look for a used copy of it, and the used copies were going for an insane amount of money at the time, like $150 a book, Wow. And this book was cool. I learned some stuff from this book. At the same time, I was finding there's a book by Tanqueray that Tan Press keeps in print called The Spiritual Life. Mm-hmm. Similar book, almost just a how-to book on the spiritual life. And then the Theology of Christian Perfection is just like, which is back in print, by the way. I just noticed that. You can buy it new now. But it's kind of like, at some level, it's not right. It's like, I think this is why it fell out of favor to be taught this way. In a sense, the spiritual life needs to be taught in discussion as like a great books type course. Like we're now dealing with the St. John Vianney Seminary out in Denver, and they have a spiritual life year where they're just reading all the great spiritual classics and the primary sources and reading it. Mm-hmm. And I really think that's kind of the better way to learn about the spiritual life than to have someone who sorted through every locution and every vision and every time a saint flew and then tried to do a scientific breakdown of like the factors that led to XYZ spiritual occurrence, But I think there's like an unhealthy attraction there. Like I'm trying to say that I love these books, and yet I see the way they could be taken the wrong way. Like Cardinal Lorenzo spoke at Georgetown once, at their graduation, and a bunch of people had to have therapy after Georgetown had to offer therapy after Cardinal Lorenzo spoke. He's an African bishop who I don't think is around anymore, but he was kind of a famous person in the church. And he said, he lifted up a catechism and he says, "Do you have one of these? If you do not have one of these, sell your shoes and buy one." So the catechism's like this amazing book, right? Like I don't think of another religion or philosophy that has something comparable to the catechism. It's an attempt to write down everything we know about love, God, life, the spiritual life, everything. Man. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the leading objection I get when people if we have like a little study session and read through chapters of the catechism is a lot of people are upset that it's not more direct. That it's not more, that it leaves things kind of up to you at the end.
Yeah.
It'll say this is wrong, but here's, some things that hedge against it, and here's some this, right? Same with the compendium and the social doctrine of the church. It's like people want to be told how to vote or exactly what movement they should join, and it's not going to tell you that, But I do think that sometimes these books are taken in the wrong way, that if you see that the Catholic Church has something the size of an old telephone book that spells out everything about life, there's people who are going to be attracted to that because they want to have all the answers.
Right. And it's like a tool to actually avoid life, right?
Right.
Like if you're too interested in the system, the rigidity or the exactitude, you're missing the experience, the people, and it's like you want to read the biography of Teresa of Avila and let that hit you, and it's not going to be obvious what that means in your life right away. It might unfold slowly over some time, and there are people that you're going to meet, and they might be difficult, they might be holy, they might be whatever, and it just has to like unfold, right? And it's not like the system I feel like can sort of hamper your experience of what is like the real,
Well, if you spend quality time with the catechism, you will come to the conclusion that it's not spelling everything out for you.
No, that's what I mean. I'm not,
So it's like, it's kind of just a idea of what the catechism should be and is, that creates the problem. And I think that a spiritual life textbook can do the same thing. This will not give you a handle on the spiritual life. At the end of the day, right? Prayer and love will start giving you that handle. But that kind of comes into the distinction between I'm now quoting the catechism, that the church is always distinguished between theology and economy. And that's, if you want to look it up, it's paragraph 236. It's this idea that there's the theology, which is kind of like philosophy and reason using revelation, which can be quite systemic, And then there is the economy, which is almost like just getting to know God. It's almost like the relationship aspect and knowing the way God seems to move in the world and things like this. And that this is an extremely valid way of knowing God. It's actually the whole ground that spiritual direction is supposed to be covering, which is a very unsystematic, almost unteachable part. It's almost like a talking through is the way you make progress in this field, not by just laying down the rules and working someone through a recipe.
Right.
So this has always made me very suspicious of anyone who treats spiritual direction as if it is a recipe, or as if you can professionalize it. Like you get this degree, you get this certification, now you're a spiritual director.
Yeah. So, and I think the recipe can be useful though, like to help a person like recognize patterns of, of the way people behave, the way God acts, so I think that's like the recipe can be useful. It's not the thing. Like the thing is, is the person, drinking from the fountain of life or not, and that's like, is the person, I don't know. You can be in tune with God without like knowing the recipe, right? The recipe can aid in that, but it's just like the aid. It's not the thing that you're.
Well, I'm trying to think this through with, maybe we're overusing the word recipe a little bit, because it's like theology is like kind of reason systematic proof often. Whereas like, even when you're in the economy realm or the realm of the unteachable, there's still things that start arising that are kind of like good rules of thumb. Yeah. And like a lot of the way Simple House teaches missionary work to new missionaries is we're kind of just telling you the rules of thumb, when this happens, you're almost always off track,
Right.
And I can't necessarily connect all the dots to you and show you exactly what scriptures, maybe there's an example in scripture, maybe there's not. But even scripture is kind of interesting as far as how much it defies being systematized completely, All right. What else do we have to say about the overall picture before we kind of go into some concerns we have about spiritual direction? One thing I wanted to say was, I can't remember which two saints I found did this, but I think it's St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, that while reading about them, I literally found one that said, the most important thing in your spiritual director is that they're very learned. Like, not that they're a good person. And then the next idea was, the other saint said, the most important thing in the spiritual director is that they're very holy. Doesn't matter if they're learned. And it was just like, wow, there's some difference of opinion here amongst, I think it's two doctors of the church, Also, St. Teresa of Avila is just kind of interesting because she had a lot of spiritual directors, a lot that she really disliked. And she also talks about sometimes the ones who kind of helped her joke around or had levity in spiritual directions were the ones who helped her most.
Yeah.
All right, go into pitfalls of spiritual direction. If you go to a spiritual director that's always in one mode, like they're always telling you everything's okay, or they're always telling you that you need to kind of like, they always want to be kind of your butt kicker, you're almost certainly going to a spiritual director that's lacking discernment.
And this is dangerous.
Yes, it's dangerous.
This is like, And I think, Teresa of Avila had a lot of spiritual directors that she thought were bad and like harmful, right? Not just like, oh, they didn't give me like really good advice and this other person always gives great advice, but like actually harmful, and I think the spiritual directors that I've had for a long time have been very good, but kind of one-off in confession or whatever, where I've gotten a little bit of spiritual direction, that there have been times when, someone was like stuck in a mode and the advice would have been disastrous in my life, and I don't think it was of God,
Another issue that's coming about that is spiritual direction, I think even in the last 20 years, has become more professional. Meaning like there's more people who are getting degrees in it. You're seeing people charge for spiritual direction services. Whereas before, I felt like it was a little bit more informal. Like you just approached someone who you felt like you related with, who was more advanced in the spiritual life, and you kind of asked for some meetings or some spiritual direction. Yeah. And I think this is an interesting phenomena. I don't want to condemn it overall, but I do think it's got some perverse issues that need to be talked about that I don't hear people talking about. And it's part of a bigger phenomena, which is this. Yeah. There's kind of been this rise of laity in the church, good or bad. But the problem that's come about is that the rise of laity in the church has kind of created a for-profit section of the church, like a spiritual industrial complex that we need to think about. And I don't hear people talk about this, meaning like, historically, the schools of holiness in the church are religious orders, right? Yeah. And there's also all these people who are giving up, taking vows of celibacy, vows of poverty, who are serving the church. And like, this is where we're getting our spiritual direction. This is where we're getting spiritual books and things like this in the church, right? Yeah. And now we have this movement where we have like lay people who might have bestsellers and might be making a ton of money off of this, and I'm not against that inherently, but it creates incentive problems. Yeah. Yep. And like if you're paying a spiritual director, are they going to tell you that the relationship's not working? Right. Right.
And I think like counselors, some counselors might have like or a therapist might have like kind of a spiritual direction focus, right? And that is I would think that is different than just a spiritual director charging money who's not a counselor. Like you pay a counselor, you pay a therapist for their services.
Right. You're kind of, all right. So we know that there are known agency issues with therapists, right? Like, do they actually, is it actually in their best interest to make you well? Right. Like therapy could go on a long time and maybe they're not actually trying to end it, and give that what it is. I don't know how to change that. I'm not against that, but that there is a known issue there. Right.
Right. But there are good therapists that do help people get well. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But in the Christian tradition, you have this added problem of you're kind of selling something you're given for free. You know what I mean? Like the wisdom that you come to in your spiritual life and through your prayer to then turn around and sell it is problematic. Yeah. Right. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't have a right to support your family and things. And that's kind of where all the confusion and all the difficulty comes from. Right. But like, it'd be better if somehow we could get the transaction out of the relationship. Right. Like, I don't pause at all if someone was hired by a retreat center and they did retreats and they're basically doing spiritual direction and they're getting paid by that retreat center and somebody might pay for the retreat. Right. But as soon as it's like just a one-on-one interaction, it just gets more and more tricky the more transactional it becomes. And it's something that we need to be aware of. And I'm not telling people to quit their spiritual directors if this is an issue, but it bothers me in general. And it is not the historic way of the Catholic Church. I'll tell you that, I think you and I have discussed whether or not this is a new issue, like in like our lifetime, or whether or not this is an issue that's been going on since the 50s or 60s. But it's not an issue that was going on hundreds of years ago, and for the majority of the life of the church, it's a new issue.
I do think, I don't know what is, I think there are people who have an authentic witness and their time is in demand And the only way they can give the amount of time that is in demand is to get paid for it, right? Because otherwise they need like another job, right? That's so I don't know how you get around that. And like retreat centers mostly don't make money, so
right. Well, I think though in general, so many people, young, love God, really get a kick out of theology. It's a very exciting field of study, right?
Yeah.
And they're kind of just looking for, how do I live my life using theology? You know what I mean? Like, should I work for the diocese? Should I become a youth minister? Should I become missionary? Should I become spiritual director, right? I would say chill out for a second, right? Like, you probably do not want to earn your money from building the kingdom. Like, that's not inherently a great thing, Like, it sounds great until you actually start doing it, and then you start realizing how it's affecting your spiritual life and how there's this like conflict of interest going on, right?
Right. Exactly.
I would say, go be a plumber and go do spiritual direction. Go figure out a way to make more money and then build the kingdom for free. And you'll also be choosier when you build the kingdom.
Yeah. I have a quibble. I feel like I have a lot of Catholic friends that have a romantic vision of being a plumber.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's like I have friends that think you can be a plumber and then come home and read philosophy and
you're usually
pray,
too worn out.
I'm like, no, that's not.
No, but it is true though that theology can be your devoted hobby in a sense. Like even when I was into aquariums in college and stuff in grad school. Mm-hmm. And I started noticing that the aquarium hobbyists, even Tropical Aquarium Magazine, I think it was called, some of the scientific papers in there were, I knew that college professors did not know as much about these fish as these hobbyists did.
Right.
Particularly guys who are just specializing in like raising fish that live in puddles in the Sahara. And keeping their genealogy and exactly when they were, harvested out of the wild. And like, it's just like, these guys are doing a very high level of work as a hobby. They're making no money. Yeah. It's costing them money to do it. Right. But what also reminds me here is like, in the past, I've had people at Simple House who wanted spiritual direction, and they'll be like, I'm just afraid that, I don't want to put the priest out or put this person out, ask them for spiritual direction. And my take is, if you're getting good spiritual direction, which is probably as much on you as it is on the spiritual director, it is very mutually rewarding.
Yeah.
Right? Like it is very edifying for both people involved, if it's productive spiritual direction. If it's unproductive spiritual direction, you'd have to pay me to suffer through that. But okay, let's talk about another conflict of interest that sometimes there's a conflict of interest that like a religious order giving spiritual direction to their own postulants can be a weird situation.
Yeah. Or people interested in the religious order.
Right.
Right.
Because they might, there is abuses of spiritual direction where people have like some goal for you and they are moving you towards that goal, through the spiritual direction. Yeah. And they are not shy about using guilt or using whatever motivations they can in there to get you there,
Yes. And sometimes they're very good at it. Right.
Right.
Yeah. So I think another way to say it is like you want a spiritual direction relationship where there's freedom for both parties, right? There's not like a conflict of interest, be it financial, be it, getting more people in your order. But also freedom. Sometimes there's like a personality issue where you don't feel free to speak your mind or
I had an issue with my spiritual director, which I've had a wonderful relationship for a very long time with my spiritual director, but I had a problem that I realized that I couldn't get a word in. So I'd show up and start getting spiritual direction and not feel like I fully shared what was going on.
Right.
But instead of like saying that it wasn't working, what I started doing was writing really long letters before I got there. He would know. I got all my thoughts out, sent it to him. And by the time I arrive, I know I got my thoughts out. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's good.
So anyway, you make it work. But
yeah, recently I had so I changed spiritual directors recently because my old spiritual director had hurt her back, but somebody suggested this one particular priest who's just like really like good at everything and really talented, and it was like that's just like the I will feel like I have to have it super together when I go see that guy. I need someone that's like batting a little less than 500.
500 is only 50%, but very high for baseball.
500 is a very good batting average. So yeah. Anyway, there has to be freedom in the relationship. Yeah.
There's this other thing happening in the church right now that I actually think is a good thing, although it certainly muddies the water with spiritual direction, is that there's a lot of things happening with different names, right? There's discipleship happening. Focus is pretty famous. I think they brought the model to the church, kind of. You see formation happening. Well, formation's always been in the church, but there is a spiritual direction aspect of that. They're literally forming you spiritually. There's accompaniment or spiritual companionship, right? Which is much more a walking of equals. I think I would call that spiritual friendship for the most part. And then there's spiritual direction. Where does one begin and one end? You know, like discipleship sounds even more intense than spiritual direction, but I don't know that it is, you know? I don't want to sort all that out, but if you're getting discipled by someone and it's a great relationship, you might be getting spiritual direction.
Yeah.
Right. And I wouldn't get hung up on the whole, like, is the person certified to do it or not? If it's a great relationship that's bearing fruit, it's probably a good relationship.
Yeah. Well, I think I think like I would think more people should be open to that you can get spiritual direction from someone that's not a priest. Like maybe there is an older person at your church that is very holy and there's a personality click, you know, and I think you could have kind of informal, but I think a good option could be saying like, hey, so-and-so, I really look up to you. I like how you've raised your kids or whatever. And I have kids, and could we meet, you know, from time to time, you know, like, I think that could be an appropriate thing to do. In our diocese, I think they're trying to encourage that, and I think that's a good thing.
But like, to what extent is it spiritual friendship? To what extent is it spiritual direction? At some level, who cares? You know, like you're trying to get spiritual help, and if you're open to it, I think it can be extremely.
Yeah, I know. Like a spiritual friendship, you might think of it as like more peer to peer, right? And it's like maybe you wouldn't think of Father Adam as your peer exactly, but there are times when it's more direction and times when it's more friendship, you know, and it's more an exchange between you and Father Adam that is more friendly.
Father Adam is my spiritual director, by the way.
Father. Right. Yeah. But I think apart from the sort of peer relationship, I think it's good to have like a mentor, you know, a person that is kind of teaching you. And
I think everything you're saying is right, Laura, but I feel like we're just like using the huge number of words, you know, mentor, discipleship, accompaniment, spiritual friendship, spiritual direction.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of making the point that these words are not all mutually exclusive.
No, right.
You know, and anybody who acts like there's a firm distinction, I would be a little bit suspicious of.
Yeah,
right. But whatever. I think they all spill over. But to bring this back to nails and tacks, or I don't know if that's really a saying or not, but how has spiritual direction affected you?
Yeah, well, so I've had like three main. Well, let's say I've had kind of four main spiritual direction experiences, and my first like official spiritual director is Father Pat. He was close to the Simple House we had in Northwest, and he is like a holy, wonderful, loving man who like really is just like head over heels in love with Jesus, you know. And a thing I kind of like about Father Pat is like he's not someone you would say like, oh, he's a conservative priest or he's a liberal priest. He is like a man that is after Jesus, and So I had a very informal relationship with him where it was like I would kind of show up and be like, Father Pat, I have this problem, and he would kind of help me work through it. And just all of that direction was how can you fall more in love with Jesus? How can you spend more of your time with Jesus? How can you focus your life more on Jesus? And but I think like there was really good spiritual guidance there. It was also like really practically, he helped me kind of navigate some of the most complicated problems, I had. There was a lot of problem solving that happened with Father Pat and crisis, kind of dealing with crisis. Like,
do you want to say anything specific about it?
We have discussed in another podcast that I had this kind of crisis after spending time with this religious order. And so after that, we were meeting like sometimes once a week because I was like kind of having a lot of emotional distress related to like my faith life, but I want to talk about in the middle of, or at the beginning of having Father Pat as my spiritual director was this like negative experience with this religious order. And when I got there, I stayed with these sisters for 2 months and they wanted me to have like a spiritual director to meet with regularly. I had kind of wanted to make this like a retreat experience for myself and just have like this like space where I could just like focus on growing in my faith, apart from like worldly temptations. That was kind of my goal, and I was open to maybe have a vocation to the religious life, but that wasn't really like the reason I was there exactly. And so they wanted me to have a spiritual director while I was there, which seemed like a good idea, even though I had one at home, was just the priest I was going to meet with. And that was like a very bad experience of spiritual direction. He had like a specific idea of what my life should be without really knowing me. He was...
Did he ask you questions about yourself? Did you feel like you could explain yourself to him?
The first time we met, he asked me some questions. We talked a little bit. And then there was like just this idea, one of the false sort of premises this religious order works with, I don't know, is like if you've ever had like a desire to be in the religious life, that must be from God because that's like not a natural desire, might seem obvious. I was young. It was not obvious to me, that is like false. Right.
But then also, if you're miserable in the religious life, it was obviously the devil trying to keep you from the religious life.
Yeah. So I had this basically we talked a little bit. I said I had thought about being a sister before, and then it's like false premise. And then the whole spiritual direction was him telling me all these stories about, people who had missed their vocation and were so unhappy and made everyone so unhappy. And this was like a sort of, I think it's like looking back, there were all these like red flags. I was like, felt very disturbed during that conversation. And one of his like crafty things that he did was go ahead and put a name on those like red flags, and saying like, sometimes you feel disturbed because, you're not really like have your eyes on God, or the devil has, kind of, he uses that disturbance. And so it was like, he kind of took away my agency and was making a lot of like pronouncements. This is what you need to be doing. This is what you need to be doing. And I think this happens a lot of times. People feel like they don't know what to do. They want to go to a spiritual director who's going to tell them exactly what to do. And it's actually like a great violation,
Right. Like one of the pitfalls of spiritual direction is that they're actually too direct.
Yeah. Right. And then they use their authority to manipulate, You
also see abuses where people kind of violate your privacy through spiritual direction. Like they're gathering information outside of it or outing things that maybe you said. I say that
Yeah.
not because that happened to you or I, but because I've seen religious orders even kind of busted up because of abuses like that are happening during spiritual direction.
Yeah.
So it's not that uncommon that these bad things happen. But it's also interesting that you had this really bad experience with spiritual direction, but then went to spiritual direction to get over it.
Yeah.
Like Father Pat had to undo what was going on with.
Right. And somebody was saying this was like an extremely traumatic thing in my life, right? Recently I heard somebody saying that they had this like traumatic thing happen in a church setting, and it's like they can't like step into a church, without like kind of having PTSD things. And I don't know. I feel like I had this thing that shifted me into like not well, and it was like staying close to healthy kind of culture, healthy priest, healthy direction in the church that was able to put me back on the right, and a more integrated path. And so that was really important for me.
And I think we'd both agree that Father Pat may be one of the best spiritual directors out there,
he's,
period.
Yeah, he's great.
But we don't think people are knocking down his door. So if you're in the DC area,
his time is in demand, though. His time is in demand.
Anyway,
but
go fill up his voicemail and try to get time with Father Pat. But then you went away from Father Pat to go to someone you thought you could relate with more. Is that what happened?
Well, it wasn't like a thing of relating to more. There was like a kind of logistical difficulty of getting to Father Pat once we were living in Southeast, and then his neighborhood was like getting really gentrified, and it was like parking was a nightmare. So there was that difficulty. But I also, was like recently married, had a baby, and had been close to this older woman who did spiritual direction with other people. And she had given me lots of good advice. And I just felt kind of called to switch over to her.
And she was a mother also, right?
She was a mother, and she and her husband had really like dedicated their lives to the poor and to the church, and I think done everything beautifully. And so she was a big help to me, but that was really different from Father Pat. So she went to like a school of spiritual direction. I think she was doing some spiritual direction before that, but she has like kind of more, and now she like teaches like a spiritual direction school, and it's a more I don't want to say formulaic in a bad way. That sounds bad.
But it is interesting
there's a format.
That you've kind of had two different spiritual directors. One that's kind of like the homegrown, like Father Pat, like just kind of went through the spiritual life. And then the other one that is more from the like trained version of a spiritual director. And you've had a good experience with both, is my sense.
Yeah, it's a good experience with both. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, my spiritual direction experience was a little bit different. I went on a retreat, asked for a spiritual director. I got one assigned to me. It was a monk. And his first words to me were, all of this is going to be about Jesus. If you don't like that, you might as well go away. Right. And he tried to like drive me away in the very first meeting. And I was like, okay, no, I'm okay. All about Jesus. He told me to go read a gospel. I did. And it was like, he really helped me make my first major decision to leave grad school and try to become a missionary. Mm-hmm. And then he helped me all the way along. And I think I said earlier that he gave me like permission to try to do Simple House. And it's not like he could ever really give permission. It's like he just kind of helped me accept that that going for it was a good way to do things. Yeah. You know what I mean? When the whole world kind of tells you to play conservative and maybe don't do it, he was just like, go for it. And I was like, yes, finally someone's giving me freedom, Right. And it was kind of an amazing experience, and we weren't meeting that often. Like, in a sense, we've broken a lot of rules of spiritual direction. Like I would probably meet with him every 3-4 months when I was meeting with him a lot, to twice a year, probably when I was meeting him very little. Mm-hmm. And it's been going on for decades, and it's been this great relationship. And I remember one time...
Decades, like 2 decades.
I know. Yeah. I'm getting tired of saying 20 years all the time, but that's my adult life is 20 years long. That's why I keep saying 20 years. But I would read about spiritual direction, about how it should be monthly or how it should be this. And there's really no official source of information on how to do spiritual direction properly, right? Yeah. And I went to him and I'm like, look, it says monthly? Should we be meeting monthly and not like every 3 months or 4 months? Or like, I kind of met with him whenever a problem was big enough I needed him. Didn't meet with him if there wasn't a problem big enough I needed him. And he said, well, does this relationship work for you? And I go, it's been working great. And he goes, well, then let's keep doing it this way. A lot of wisdom in that statement, by the way.
Yeah.
And another time I was like, well, my spiritual director doesn't even live in the same state with me. I have to do this great travel. Shouldn't I have a local one too? And then I remember I found this this priest at Dominican House who was kind of famous, it seemed like. He'd just come from Steubenville, and he'd been a very popular spiritual director there. And I asked him to be my spiritual director, which was just strange because I already kind of had a great relationship, but it was just so far away, it was like 4 states away. So I asked to meet with him, and then he realized that what I would really wanted out of spiritual direction was to like come with a crisis and a problem, get an answer, and go do it. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, having this problem, what should I do? Like, I've already tried everything that I can think of, or I'm conflicted in this basic way. I need to know what to do.
Yeah.
And he freaked out, and he's like, what you want out of spiritual direction is like some desert father type or something like that. That is not what I do.
Yeah.
You are not my spiritual director. You like fired me in the second meeting. And it's really wise. I mean, it was true that that's what I wanted. That's what I think I even needed. And it's been great that I got it, but it was just not going to come from him. And that relationship wasn't going to work. And he knew that. And we moved on.
Yeah.
I want to tell a story about something that happened to my spiritual director, because I don't know when we'll ever get to tell this story in a different podcast. But after Simple House had started, and my spiritual director, in a sense, had been so important in allowing me to do it, I was kind of like, are you ever going to come visit? And it's difficult for a monk to get random permission to go like across the nation to go see a ministry, But he kind of saved it up, like that monks are occasionally allowed vacations. And he said, all right, this is what I want to do, right? And he came, and in the morning he came to DC to see Simple House was the morning I'd taken one of the best friends of the ministry to the hospital to have a baby. And it was Father Adam's 50th birthday. And this baby was born on his 50th birthday. And I remember picking him from the airport, and instead of going to Simple House, I went straight to the hospital, and he held this baby who is 0 years old today while he was 50 years old today.
Yeah.
And it was very, just like this seemed providential, right? And then we had a great visit. And the next morning we go up, and I'm going to go take him to meet some families in the ministry. And we go to this family that's kind of been a rough family. There was like 12 kids, and the mom was kind of a tough character, not a very nice person. And they were deep in this project neighborhood in DC that was, I probably would have never started. I started visiting them because a former social worker really thought Simple House should meet them. And so I went to meet them. And they moved to this new project neighborhood. I can't remember the name of this neighborhood, but it was a really poorly set up neighborhood where you had to kind of like go really into the interior. And there was a lot of ways you could get carjacked, like on single lane roads by just like one dude or something. And so it just felt like I would rather have a getaway, or, it's weird to say, but you need to be very safety conscious when you're going into these neighborhoods, and this was just one of the most unsafe, And so I get Father Adam, and he's wearing his collar and his clericals, and we go to visit this family, and we walk in the door, and the family's all in shock, which is already shocking that a priest is walking through the very inner part of this neighborhood. But the mom had died a few hours before we arrived.
Yeah.
And everyone was just sitting around dumbfounded about what it meant that their mom had died. Like they just carried her out, like the paramedics. And Father Adam walked in, and we prayed with the family, and it was just like such a strange, like, it felt like miracle's like the wrong word, but it just felt weirdly like God was engineering things, that the first time these kids ever saw a priest like that was going to be the day, a few hours after their mom died, walking into a place a priest never goes, And anyway, so just a very kind of special relationship with this priest. And
I also it's like interesting that for him, from his like experience, it's like spiritual direction gave him an avenue to have like kind of the most like intimate experience of like life and death, you know.
Right.
This sort of
right. And he also would preach a lot of Simple House retreats. And one time I was at the monastery, and the monastery has this enormous like guest refectory. It's basically a dining hall. All right. So it's great that it's enormous, because if you're on silent retreat, you can go to the back and get like a table and no one's going to bother you, right? So there's very few retreatants. I'm there, and there's these two guys, middle-aged guys, like in their 40s, sitting at this table, kind of apart, being quiet. And I go sit with them. And I go, hey, what are you guys doing here? And they're like, we're here for spiritual direction. And I go, oh, I am too. Who are you going to spiritual direction with? And then they say, my spiritual director. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I go, well, you know, what do you guys do? And one's like, he almost mumbles it. He goes, I'm a pastor.
Yeah.
And I'm like, a pastor what? Like the Assemblies of God. Like 2 states over. And then the other guy was also an Assemblies of God pastor, and they were both there getting spiritual direction. And it was so strange, because it's like, I said to your congregations, no, you're here. And they're like, we would not be able to tell our congregations that we came here. This is a very conservative Protestant group. You know, you don't go to Catholic monasteries for spiritual direction if you're in that group, you know. And so he was doing this kind of interesting, like even cross-denominational ministry. And even here where I live here in Kansas City, I live in this transitional neighborhood, and I met my neighbor up the street. He's an evangelical Protestant. And right when we first met, we started talking about religion a little bit. And I mentioned, I have this spiritual director. He goes, oh, who? And I go, well, no, he's at a monastery a couple hours away. He's like, no, who? And I like named the name, and he goes, oh yeah, I heard of that guy. A lot of people think he's Yoda. In Protestant world, that was an interesting way to put it, you know. So anyway,
that's hilarious.
My spiritual direction has been very fulfilling like that. It doesn't fit the normal rhythm of spiritual direction. And I honestly think more people need to be open to having spiritual direction that doesn't fit the normal rhythm. And I think spiritual directors should think about that too. But that's probably all I got to share about that. Well, let's wrap this up. Why has Simple House not done spiritual direction? 3 reasons. 1, when we started, I was like 25, and I was not going to spiritually direct anyone who was like 23. Didn't seem appropriate, or it was in the same situation. Another reason was we did not want to be a cult.
Right.
Meaning, like, there was kind of like an idea that we wanted everyone to have their own spirituality, go about it their own way, and not all converge on one spirituality. And that sounds like an obvious thing, except when you realize how many cults there ends up being, and no one set out to be one. So you have to be wary of that stuff, you know? And the other thing was conflict of interest. Like, we have something at Simple House called accountability meetings, where we'll meet with someone and say, how you doing? What are you trying to do? If we have an issue with how they're doing, we'll mention it during that meeting. But it's also like...
It's kind of like a work eval.
It's a work eval, but a lot of people use it to say, like...
Personal...
How do I keep growing? What do I want to do in the future? Am I going to stay at Simple House or leave Simple House? And I used to get alarmed at these meetings, like when people would want to leave Simple House, and I'd be like, what are we going to do if half the community leaves? But these meetings have become really great as long as I focus on, I am here for the best of this person, not for the best of the ministry, not for the best of myself. I'm here for this person, you know?
Yeah.
And they've been fulfilling meetings, but it highlights that there is a conflict of interest. Like, me literally counseling people to stay at Simple House is me solving a staffing problem.
Yeah. Right. So, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, and there needs to be just freedom, total freedom. Right. Yeah.
So we always encourage spiritual direction, but we don't do it.
Right. Yeah.
And that's that. You got anything else you want to add, Laura?
I do not.
All right.
I think that is that. Yeah.
Wrapping up. Thank you for listening to the Simpleton Podcast. Talk to you later.
Bye, Clark.
Bye.